So then we are back with more understanding from the time of the second tabernacle services, where we find then the Aramaic English translation of the word most helpful at the moment, because indicating then the time of the end as per then the instructions or then the Torah, where then we find ourselves during the time of the end, of time of restoration and reduction. So then we have our bearings set properly as the Messiah has taught us. Very importantly these days, where many nations are becoming more integrated, there is a system yet coming in the future where the countries are going to be absolutely integrated in a system. And then comparing these futuristic lives we are living in versus then the past, where most of the countries were independent and they did not have computerized systems integrating them at once, we find in ourselves in another type of lifestyle very distinct from the past. So understanding the time of the African continent during the 60s, where the apartheid was very strong, we begin then our quest understanding what the Messiah had taught regarding racism. Very important, because these days where then there is an integration of systems of countries, yet racism yet is very big. So then, contrary to what many people were thinking of the integration of countries would bring down racism, in fact it starts then the contrary. It then becomes a race to whomever you begin your quest versus then the race that would reach these integrated systems first. So it's not very far away from the apartheid of the past. We are simply using other subjects and then achieving the same goal. Back in the old days, in the 60s, the apartheid simply had absolutely a division of race in order to secure leadership. Today we have then liberty of races, but then it has changed to leadership first comes, first grabs, and then ruling and power over reason. So it's not an improvement from the past. In fact, if we truly compare the past and today, the past had more chances of advancement than today. Because back in the old days, though there were apartheids in many parts of the world, when people were then balanced in reason and power, there were more chances for advancement, because then systems could yet be developed. Today, many systems, they are already developed. So there is no chance of improvement when there is a racism going on from countries and then types of people in reaching power leadership without reasoning. It's truly a fine line, and we find then, for instance, the great example of the African people, Mr. Mandela. He spent many years in prison, 27 years in prison, because he was then a leader of the time against the apartheid. So he learned many years doing hard labor, and he learned a very important point of then reason and power mixed together, very balanced. So what has then the African people learned today from his example? Do we find then his example being honored or being then taken in relevancy? Unfortunately not. There are many parts of the country that do take very seriously what he has done, absolutely, no question. But then if we evaluate what goes on then in Central Africa, then in Sudan, South and North, in many other areas of the continent of Africa, they don't understand yet reason and power mixed together. if we evaluate very cautiously, we find then those countries up north integrated system-wise, but then neglecting reason. As Mr. Mandela many times he said after his imprisonment and he became president, there is then obviously space for then many races and to live together. So then there are many leaders giving us examples in the past where then systems were yet to be improved. Today we find most of the systems already improved, because truly economics and finances, the system is workable. However, people, when they come to power, they want to satisfy themselves so badly, and then simply they destroy the system. So it's a race for what race, or then what color of skin, or what kind of a status reaches first, and they ransack the entire country or then the entire system, because they do not know how to have a balance of reason and power. So let's then evaluate what the Messiah had said regarding power and reason. We find ourselves during the time of Yehuda. Yehuda then was a person related with the Messiah. He was a servant of the Messiah and of the brother Yaakov, the brother of the Messiah. And then what went on during the time of Yehuda? So then he was writing, explaining then the group of people going out to form another holy city. Very important. He explains then what went on with the people and what kind of situation they were enduring in order to write to the other brothers their trials and tribulations. However, as they were on their way, there were other people from Gentiles trying to infiltrate the holy separated people, and they were causing trouble. Obviously, they were already contaminated with the world, and then Yehud explains them the importance of maintaining themselves clear in order to serve Yahweh, and then becoming a city, and then helping the other nations. So then the understanding comes from this time where we then find ourselves very balanced, understanding what then later Yohanan in the first holy city taught us how to have a relationship of cities and Gentiles. So then the understanding comes from as the truth and truths return. So then, back in the 60s, we understand per prophecy, they were living during the time of deceit in terms of what they thought was divine. As we understand it from the prophecies, then the Messiah, when he was born a king, and he had his already given 1,000 years. So then when you read the Autumn Feast, 20th chapter, or Revelation, 20th chapter, you find 1,000 years of the rule of the Messiah already gone. Then you find the other 1,000 years given to Nahashatan, already gone, ended in 2009 or 6009 or 7009 if you use then 1,000 years calendar, or then if you start with 0. So then, evaluating from the viewpoint of the Messiah, then we find the cities as role models. And then the role model being the city is the relationship of the Messiah and Gentiles. Gentiles as individuals and Gentiles as nations. Most importantly, as Gentiles as nations. Because the purpose of the holy cities then is directing the nations. This is what the Messiah intended for his people. They would be then a light to the nations. So then when we are speaking of cities, the primary objective is directing nations. then people. So when we read then Yehuda, we find then obviously areas where we should be very acquainted with, understanding what Yehuda then is explaining. Later we find then sections of the Second Tabernacle services where then the leaders of the service area we find then, because they had a specific task in working the land around the holy city or holy cities, in maintaining those lands, prepared, harvested animals, and providing for the holy cities. So when you read leaders of the people during the Second Tabernacle services, you find leaders of the service areas. So then you have to understand what the Messiah explained to his people to do, and as they did, then in turn the Gentiles involved with the maintenance of the land for the set apart, they also have leaders over the land, making sure the harvest is done on time, make sure then the crops are watered, make sure then the animals are taken care of, make sure then the slaughterings are done in the proper fashion, so then the city can be properly maintained. In turn, the cities, they directed the nations. Leaders of the world come and then they receive directives from the people of Yahweh. So then you find then the proper balance of power and then reason. So then as we begin to understand the returning of the holy cities, we already are lining up ourselves in what's coming in the future, because truly the light or the Messiah is then given to us as we understand what the Messiah expects from us. Then the balance of reason and power is properly measured. So then in many countries, in many nations around the world, they were then born, many of the Gentiles during the time of the seat, where then in the past was a race to the first in power to do whatever they want, always causing trouble. However, when a person then is placed in power with the reason already measured from the Holy Scripture, from the truth of the returning of the holy cities, then a person starts with the proper measure of power then and reason. Because the Messiah came to give us the example, and we should not be above the Messiah. We can, through many years of learning, many years of study, many years of experience, be close to what the Messiah was. Somewhat far away from what he was, but coming closer. What the Messiah was trying to say is, there are the steps of formation where then the Messiah is the very top. And as we come closer to him, we become like him. Always balancing power and reason. Power and reason. Because the power comes from heaven and was given to the Son, and in turn to his people. In turn comes the functions where then his people direct the nations. And then we treat each other as then the same way the Messiah treats his people, the same way his Father, Yahweh, treats the Son. So then we begin to understand and begin our advancement in teaching those people in power that they are not there to gorge themselves with the power and then discarding reason. Because the Messiah has taught us the reason why then the set apart were placed in a position of power. However, this power given to the set apart, the power is neutral. It's a power of the holy cities not interfering with the governments of the world. So when they come and they explain their problems, they are given answers. So directing the nations. So then when we read then many areas of the Second Tabernacle services, you find then the Messiah being the top of the Second Tabernacle services. Then you find leaders of the service area of the land. There is a section of it where you find then for the leaders of the land to use a bit of salt when they deal with the workers of the land. What does it mean? A person uses reason from the Torah, teachings of the Torah, not to control them, but in order to avert influences trying to take over the power. Then use a bit of salt in your teaching. Use a bit of the Torah and the teachings of the Messiah to make sure they have the proper perspective in service and power. Reason and power. This is what the Messiah then is explained. So then we become more aware of the work of many leaders around the world. Because truly, what many of these leaders went through, those situations were not very easy. But then for a time, there was reason and power working together, even though it was during the time of the deceit. And then worked for a time. But then we observe what goes on around the world, a race to reach power, to do whatever they want. And then causes more trouble because the system is becoming more and more integrated. If a person goes there without the proper understanding and the proper balance, what causes is then people being concerned of not receiving what they should have. So then when the truth returns, then we are prepared and we understand whosoever people have the power has to have a reason to work both of them together as the Messiah has taught us. So it's very important. Later we are going to explore more then of the service people and their relationship with the leadership. So then we become more and more prepared for what's coming. So please stay tuned. Much more coming up.